The older I get, the more I realize my family didn't survive by talking about things. We survived by enduring them. And for a long time, I thought silence was just normal. Avoiding difficult conversations was normal. I thought carrying pain quietly was normal. Pretending everything was okay while everybody was emotionally drowning was normal. But when I started really looking at the birth charts of the women in my family, my grandmother, my mother, and eventually myself, I realized something. The silence didn't start with me, it was inherited. Welcome back to Sister Signs and Red Flags, the podcast where astrology ain't therapy, but girl, it's close. I'm your host, Lika, and today's episode is a little different because today we are not talking about men, we're not talking about dating, and we're not talking about red flags in relationships at all. Today, I want to talk about the women before me, my grandmother, my mother, and the emotional patterns that quietly move through families when survival becomes more important than communication. And before I go any further, this is not an episode about blame. This is definitely not about me dragging my mama. This is not me saying anybody was a bad person. In fact, one of the hardest things about growing up is realizing the people who loved you were also carrying things they never fully healed from themselves. And I think for a long time, especially in Black families, survival became the priority, not emotional processing or vulnerability or communication. It was survival. And honestly, that survival saved a lot of us, but it also created generations of people who loved each other deeply and still struggled to actually talk to each other. So let me start here. Most people probably would have looked at my life early on and assumed I would become a statistic. I was a teen mom. I dropped out of high school, and compared to my siblings, my path looked very different. And I know whether people said it directly or not, there were assumptions attached to that. But one thing about me, once life tried to define me, I became determined to redefine myself. And honestly, a lot of that came from my mama because my mama worked hard, real hard. Like my girl would be working three, four jobs. I'm like, how you even work three, four jobs, girl? But she did because, she figured things out. She sacrificed, she survived, and she made things happen even when I know she was probably very overwhelmed herself. My mama, and I'm not gonna kid y'all, my mama is definitely my superhero in a lot of ways. And I think watching her survive made me feel like failure was never an option. Like, no matter what happened to me, I was going to show people better than I could tell them. But our relationship has not always been easy. There was a period where me and my mom didn't speak for over a year. And that situation hurt me so bad. It affected me very deeply because despite everything, I love my mom so much. I remember one time she was sick and I had just gotten off work after working a midnight shift, and I drove 8 hours from Mississippi to Georgia to check on her and to try to help her because I wanted to make sure she was okay. But when I got there, my mom, she looked at me and said, "Why are you even here? We're not even that close." And I can't explain what that felt like because my actions said otherwise, right? Like, you don't drive 8 hours completely exhausted after an overnight shift for somebody who you don't love or who you don't feel like you're close to. So I left and we stopped speaking. But thinking about it now, that time apart was probably very necessary because sometimes space forces everybody to sit with the things nobody has been saying out loud. And that's when I started noticing a pattern in my family. In my family, silence wasn't a red flag. Silence was absolutely a shield. But the older I got, that same shield was also keeping us from truly knowing each other emotionally because we don't really discuss things, but we carry them. We will avoid them and we will damn sure gossip around them and sweep everything up under the rug. But directly addressing the pain, that was a non-existence, almost harder part, right? And so when I started looking at the astrology, I realized that pattern didn't start with my mom. It goes back generations. So when I first started studying astrology, I think I approached it the same way most people do. You know, what sign is toxic, who acts like this, why do I keep attracting this same type of person and this same type of energy? But the deeper I got into astrology, the less interested I became in stereotypes and the more interested I became in patterns, especially relationship and family patterns. Because one thing astrology will do is show you what keeps repeating itself emotionally across generations. And when I looked at my grandmother's chart, my mother's chart, and eventually my own, I realized something that honestly shook me a little bit. The women in my family all learned how to survive emotionally, but in very different ways. But survival was always the theme. My grandmother has heavy Taurus energy all through her chart. Taurus placements are often associated with stability, endurance, survival, perseverance. And honestly, that describes my grandmother perfectly in that generation, especially because they survived by pushing through, by enduring, and by adapting and continuing. And I think sometimes people romanticize that kind of strength without realizing what it costs emotionally. Because when survival becomes the priority, feelings often become secondary. You don't sit around processing emotions when you're just trying to make it through life. So, a lot of people from that particular generation learn to keep moving, keep working, and keep surviving. And that was even if emotionally nobody was really okay. Then I looked at my mother's chart, and my mama is an Aries sun, which honestly makes so much sense to me because Aries women are fighters. They push through, they protect, they lead, and they absolutely survive. And my mother absolutely did that. Don't get me wrong, her Aries sun definitely stood out to me. But what stood out to me more than her Aries sun was everything underneath it. Her Mercury and Pisces, her Chiron and Pisces, her Neptune and Scorpio. And suddenly I started understanding something. My mother isn't emotionally shallow at all. If anything, I think she feels things very deeply. But her chart feels like somebody who learned to carry emotional pain internally instead of expressing it directly. And if you know my mama today, that ain't the case. She know how to express it very well now. But that started making parts of our relationship make even more sense to me because most of my life I interpreted emotional distance as a lack of love. But now I think some people love you deeply and still don't know how to emotionally communicate that love in healthy ways, especially if they were raised in environments where emotions were avoided, minimized, or quietly carried instead of openly discussed. Because I know for a fact, like my mother did not grow up in a household to where it was like, oh, I love you, I love you, I love you, I care about you, you're my child, I'm so proud of you. Like my mother, she didn't grow up with that. that. And so we didn't grow up with that either. And one of the things that I know about me is I never heard my mama tell me she was proud of me. I never necessarily needed her to say, I love you. But there was this part of me that always wanted to hear my mother say that she was proud of me. I never got that growing up because, of course, I felt like a disappointment in so many ways. But once I graduated from college, my mom gave a speech at my graduation party, and that's when she said that she was proud of me. With that being said, that's one of the hardest things about adulthood is realizing your parents were people before they were your parents. You know, they were people with wounds, people with fears, people with survival instincts, and people carrying things you may never fully know about, right? And then eventually I looked at my own chart and baby, that's when everything clicked because my chart is full of communication energy, Gemini placements everywhere. Mercury in the third house, North Node in Gemini. My chart literally says, talk about it, girl, name it, write it, speak it, process it, and tell that story. For a long time, I wouldn't talk. But when I finally found my voice and started to speak, now it's like I won't shut up. So that's why y'all got me talking on this thing because I won't shut up because now silence definitely feels very uncomfortable because I think I came into this lifetime specifically to understand things through words. And maybe that's why storytelling became so important to me too. Because when you grow up in environments where people don't openly discuss emotions, you start searching for language everywhere. And that realization changed the way I looked at my family because for a long time, I think I viewed emotional silence as rejection. Definitely. If people aren't talking about something, then maybe it doesn't matter and maybe you don't matter. But now I think silence in families is often much more complicated than that. I think sometimes silence is protection, shame, and sometimes silence is survival. And also sometimes people avoid conversations because they generally do not have the emotional tools to navigate them. And I think that's especially true in a lot of Black families because let's be honest, a lot of our families have survived things that were never fully processed emotionally, like generationally, right? So poverty, abuse, addiction, religion, teen pregnancy, infidelity, violence, and definitely mental health struggles and family secrets. And instead of discussing these things openly, a lot of families learn how to function around them, which means entire generations became emotionally conditioned to keep it moving, even when something hurts, even when something breaks you. You know what I'm saying? Even when something changes you forever, it's like this common theme like you just have to keep going, push through it, you know? You can do it. And one thing I had to really sit with was this: my mother's love for me and the pain I experienced from our relationship can both exist at the same time. Those things are not mutually exclusive because I know my mother loves me. You know, I've never questioned whether my mother sacrificed for me and my siblings. I have never questioned whether she worked hard because I saw it with my own eyes, you know. I have never questioned whether she survived for us because indeed she did her thing. But emotional closeness was a part that had always been more complicated. And to be quite frankly, I think becoming a teen mother shaped our relationships in ways I probably didn't fully understand at that time either. Because now that I'm older, I can imagine how afraid she probably was for me. I can certainly imagine the disappointment, the worry, and the fear of what my life might become, especially because the society already has a script prepared for girls like me. Teen mom, high school dropout, done, finished, and statistic. But weirdly enough, it was those experiences that made me even more determined. Something inside me became obsessed with proving, baby, my story is not ending here. To keep it a bug, I think I inherited that from the women before me. Because, baby, let me tell you, I don't want to sit here and tell y'all my accolades, but your girl, although she did not finish high school, she got her GED. Your girl has 4 degrees, okay? Your girl does not feel like a failure. My grandmother survived, my mother survived, and then I learned how to survive too. But I think what survival looked like changed with each generation. My grandmother's survival looked like carrying, enduring, making do, and holding things together quietly. My mother's survival looked more like sacrificing, providing, pushing through no matter what emotionally. And me, I think my survival became the labor of the heart, trying to understand things emotionally, trying to communicate what everybody else learned to suppress, even myself, right? But also trying to heal patterns instead of just enduring them. And that kind of work is very hard too. Because emotional labor is still labor. Breaking cycles is still work. Being the person in a family who finally says, no, let's talk about this, that comes with its own kind of weight. But I think my generation is asking a different question now. It's not just how do we survive, but it's how do we heal? And I think those are two very different journeys because survival teaches you how to endure. Healing teaches you how to feel. Survival says keep going, right? Healing says stop, acknowledge what happened to you. Survival says, don't fall apart. Healing says, you are allowed to. And I think for a long time, the women in my family did not have the luxury of falling apart. They all had children to raise, bills to pay, and lives to maintain, responsibilities. You know what I'm saying? So they endured. And maybe that endurance is the reason why I'm even able to be here and have this conversation with you now, which makes me look at my mother differently. Not perfectly, not through rose colored glasses, but with more context, more compassion, and more understanding. Because adulthood has taught me something very humbling. Your parents are often figuring life out in real time while raising you. And sometimes the things that hurt you were never intentional wounds. Sometimes they were inherited coping mechanisms. Sometimes they were survival responses passed down so long, nobody even realized they were patterns anymore. And maybe that's why astrology has become so meaningful to me because astrology doesn't just help me understand myself, it helps me understand people with more nuance. It reminds me that people are layered, complicated, contradictory, and human as fuck. My mother is an Aries, but she's a woman with deep Pisces placement. My grandmother had all that Taurus survival energy, but also Cancer, Venus, and Chiron. And me, I'm the Gemini daughter trying to turn silence into language, trying to make sense of emotional patterns through words, trying to understand the women before me instead of only judging them through the pain I experience. And I think that's why this episode felt important for me to make during Taurus season specifically, because Taurus energy is often associated with comfort, stability, consistency. But what people don't always talk about is how families can become emotionally attached to survival patterns too, even unhealthy ones, even painful ones. Sometimes what feels normal in a family is actually just familiar suffering. And it takes somebody finally stopping long enough to say, wait a minute, why do we keep doing this? And I think that's part of my role in my family. Not to expose everybody and not to embarrass anybody and to not act like I'm more evolved than the people before me because I am absolutely not. But just to notice the patterns and put a name to them. To speak about the things that were only whispered about before because silence may protect people temporarily, but eventually silence also becomes heavy, especially when generations of people are carrying emotions nobody fully acknowledges. And the older I get, the more I realize healing isn't always loud. Sometimes healing is simply finally having that conversation, finally acknowledging the hurt, and like finally admitting something affected you, finally understanding your parents as human beings instead of superheroes or villains, just simply human as fuck. And I also think one of the hardest parts of growing up is grieving the version of your parents you thought existed. Because when we're children, our parents feel larger than life, but adulthood forces you to see they were learning too. They were surviving too. They were carrying things too. And sometimes they pass down coping mechanisms instead of very much so needed emotional tools because that's all they were given. And that makes me a little emotional now thinking about my mother because despite everything, I knew that she did the best she could with what she had emotionally at the time. And I think two things, as I've said, can be true simultaneously. I can acknowledge the ways our relationship hurt me and still deeply love and appreciate my mama. I don't think healing requires pretending pain never existed. I think healing is being honest about it and without losing compassion. Astrology helped me stop looking at people as one dimensional. It helped me stop reducing people to good or bad. And it helped me to understand emotional context and patterns and generational things. And it helped me to realize sometimes people are not intentionally withholding love. They simply learn how to survive in emotional restrictive environments. And survival doesn't always teach people how to communicate affection openly. So when I look at the women in my family now, I don't just see silence anymore. I see endurance, I see sacrifice, and I see fear. I see emotional protection. I see survival instincts. And I also see a whole lot of love. Maybe not always perfectly expressed and not always communicated clearly, but love nonetheless. And that's what I really wanted this episode to say. Sometimes what gets passed down through generation isn't just eye color or recipes or mannerisms. Sometimes what gets inherited is emotional survival, the things people avoided, the things they normalized, and the things nobody fully discussed. And maybe part of healing is finally becoming aware of what you inherited emotionally so you can consciously decide what you want to carry forward and what you do not. So, yeah, this episode was a little different, but I think this may be one of the most important conversations I've had on this podcast so far because understanding the women before me has helped me understand myself more deeply too. And before I go, I just want to say this: if your relationship with your mother is beautiful, cherish it. If it's complicated, know that you are not alone. If it's distant, I see you. And if you're somewhere in the middle, still trying to understand everything you inherited emotionally, I definitely see you too. So the question for today is, what emotional patterns do you think were passed down in your family? And have you ever looked at your family's astrology and noticed repeated themes? Because, baby, like, I'ma just tell you, girls, once you see it, you can't unsee it because it is very much so eye opening. And I'm not gonna hold y'all any longer, but before I do go, I do want to say happy Mother's Day to all the mothers and to all those who will be mothers one day too. Enjoy your very special day, and thank you so much for listening to this Mother's Day episode of Sister Signs and Red Flags. Until next time, y'all, stay cute, stay petty, and be safe out there. Bye.